In March of 1891, when city officials finally broke the locks on St. Mercy General Hospital's basement morgue in Boston's North End, they discovered 213 detailed patient files, each marked with the same cryptic notation, called to glory during sacred treatment. What made these files terrifying wasn't just the sheer number of deaths over 16 years, but the identical final symptoms that didn't match any known diseases of the era. The Catholic diocese immediately sealed all records, but not before investigators copied documents that revealed a pattern so disturbing it would challenge everything the Irish immigrant community believed about divine healing. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale of St. Mercy General Hospital, I need to tell you something. This channel isn't for everyone. Only the bravest souls dare to explore the darkest corners of America's religious history, and few channels have the courage to tell the stories we tell here. If you're one of those rare individuals who isn't afraid to uncover the terrifying truths that powerful institutions tried to bury, then hit that subscribe button right now. And I want to know, comment below and tell me what city or state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to be part of our community of truth seekers? Let's find out together what really happened in those basement chambers of St. Mercy General Hospital. The story I'm about to tell you begins in 1874, but its roots stretch back to the terrible potato famine that drove hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics to America's shores, carrying nothing but hope and desperate faith. Boston's North End in 1874 was a maze of narrow cobblestone streets where Gaelic could be heard more often than English. The Irish immigrants who crowded into the three-story tenements had fled starvation in their homeland, only to face a different kind of desperation in America. Yellow fever outbreaks were common, factory accidents maimed workers regularly, and childbirth claimed mothers at alarming rates. The established Protestant hospitals charged fees that most Irish families couldn't afford, and many refused Catholic patients altogether, citing moral concerns about their religious practices. Into this void stepped Dr. Charles Whitman, Sister Margaret O'Connor, and Chaplain Robert Sullivan, who announced in the spring of 1874 that they would open St. Mercy General Hospital as a beacon of divine healing for God's forgotten children. The three-story brick building on Salem Street had previously housed a textile warehouse, but the trio spent months converting it into what appeared to be a legitimate medical facility. The first floor contained a reception area dominated by a massive wooden crucifix, treatment rooms with proper medical equipment, and a small chapel where patients could pray before procedures. The second floor housed patient wards with 20 beds, each bearing hand-carved religious symbols. But it was the basement that would become the source of nightmares, a series of rooms they called sacred treatment chambers, where, they claimed, the most miraculous healings would take place. Dr. Whitman presented impressive credentials from the University of Edinburgh, claiming specialization in experimental therapeutics blessed by divine guidance. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 50s with piercing blue eyes and prematurely white hair that he kept meticulously groomed. His hands were always impeccably clean, and he wore a small silver cross on his lapel, details that made desperate families trust him implicitly. Sister Margaret O'Connor appeared to be a genuine Catholic nun, complete with traditional habit and rosary beads that never left her side. She spoke with a soft Irish accent and possessed an almost supernatural ability to comfort frightened patients with whispered prayers and gentle touches. Chaplain Sullivan, a robust man with a booming voice, conducted services that could be heard 3 blocks away. His sermons about divine healing drew crowds of hundreds, and his blessing ceremonies became legendary throughout the Irish Quarter. The hospital's reputation grew through word-of-mouth testimonials that seemed too miraculous to be false. Families whispered about relatives who had entered St. Mercy with terminal consumption, only to emerge completely cured after receiving blessed treatments in the basement chambers. Stories spread of broken bones healing overnight, of children's fevers breaking instantly after receiving sanctified medicine, and of elderly patients regaining strength they hadn't possessed in decades. The treatments were always free for families who couldn't pay, funded, according to Dr. Whitman, by generous benefactors who wished to remain anonymous in their Christian charity. What made these testimonials particularly convincing was their specificity. Margaret Flynn would tell anyone who listened how her 7-year-old son Tommy had been dying of pneumonia when she brought him to St. Mercy in desperation. After 3 days of sacred treatments, Tommy was running through the streets again, healthier than he'd ever been. Patrick O'Brien swore his wife Mary had been cured of consumption that 3 other doctors had declared fatal. These weren't vague claims of improvement. These were complete transformations that defied medical explanation. The Irish Catholic community embraced St. Mercy as proof that God favored their suffering people. Father McKenna of St. Leonard's Church regularly sent parishioners to the hospital, praising Dr. Whitman's combination of medical science and divine intervention. The Boston Pilot, the city's Irish Catholic newspaper, published glowing articles about the miracle hospital of the North End and its trinity of healing angels. Even skeptical Protestant newspapers acknowledged that something remarkable was happening at St. Mercy, though they attributed it to the powerful effects of faith and suggestion upon the immigrant mind. By 1876, St. Mercy General Hospital was treating nearly 200 patients per month, with a waiting list that stretched for weeks. Families would camp outside the building, sleeping on the cobblestones in hopes of securing treatment for their loved ones. Dr. Whitman instituted a selection process he called divine guidance, claiming he prayed over each application and accepted. Only those patients whom God revealed were ready for healing. This selective admission policy only increased the hospital's mystique and made families even more desperate to gain entry. The hospital's success attracted attention from medical professionals throughout New England. Dr. Harrison Wells, from Massachusetts General Hospital, requested permission to observe the miraculous procedures, but was politely refused on grounds that divine healing required pure faith, unmarred by scientific skepticism. When pressed for details about his treatment methods, Dr. Whitman would smile gently and explain that he combined traditional medical knowledge with sacred rituals passed down through generations of faithful healers. He claimed his medications were purified through prayer and blessed during holy ceremonies, making them far more effective than ordinary pharmaceuticals. The first crack in St. Mercy's divine facade appeared on the fog-shrouded morning of October 13, 1876, when 8-year-old Bridget McCarthy stumbled out of the hospital's basement chambers in a state that witnesses would later struggle to describe coherently. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley, who was waiting in the reception area for news of her own husband's treatment, watched in horror as the child emerged from the basement stairs, walking in an unnaturally rigid manner. Her small hands clenched into fists so tight that her fingernails had drawn blood from her palms. She moved like a wind-up toy. Mrs. O'Malley would later tell investigators, her voice trembling with the memory. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't seeing anything in this world. And the smell, dear God, the smell that followed her up those stairs was like nothing I'd ever encountered. It wasn't medicine or disinfectant. It was sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long on a grave. Bridget's lips were moving constantly, but no sound emerged. When Sister Margaret O'Connor rushed to intercept the child, Bridget suddenly began speaking in what sounded like Latin, though her voice carried an otherworldly quality that made several witnesses cross themselves instinctively. The words weren't the familiar Latin of church services, but something older, more guttural, that seemed to come from deep within her chest rather than her throat. Dr. Whitman appeared within moments, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible agitation. He swept Bridget into his arms and carried her back toward the basement, but not before Mrs. O'Malley noticed something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The child's fingernails, which had been normal when her mother brought her in 2 days earlier, were now completely black, as if they'd been dipped in ink or burned from within. "She's experiencing divine visions," Dr. Whitman explained hastily to the concerned families in the waiting area. "Sometimes the sacred treatments open doorways to heavenly realms that overwhelm young minds. She needs complete quiet and continued prayer to return safely to our world." His words were reassuring, but his hands shook slightly as he spoke, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool October air. Bridget McCarthy was never seen again. When her mother, Ellen McCarthy, arrived the following day to check on her daughter's progress, Sister Margaret O'Connor met her at the reception desk with tears in her eyes and devastating news. Little Bridget had been called home to God during the night, her small heart unable to withstand the overwhelming joy of divine communion. The child's body, they explained, had been so transformed by holy light that it was no longer suitable for earthly viewing, and had already been blessed and buried in the hospital's private cemetery behind the building. Ellen McCarthy's anguished screams echoed through the North End that afternoon, but her grief was tempered by the gentle explanations provided by Chaplain Sullivan. He spent hours with the bereaved mother, explaining how blessed she was to have given birth to a child so pure that God had chosen her for immediate sainthood. Bridget hadn't died, he assured her. She had graduated to a higher realm of existence and was now interceding in heaven for other sick children who needed healing. The story might have ended there, just another tragic loss in a community accustomed to death. Except for what happened 3 days later. Mrs. O'Malley's husband, Patrick, emerged from his own basement treatment, completely cured of the tuberculosis that had been slowly killing him for months. His recovery was so complete and dramatic that it overshadowed any lingering questions about Bridget McCarthy's strange final moments. Patrick O'Malley lived for another 37 years, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 79. His lungs perfectly healthy until the day he died. Word of Patrick's miraculous cure spread through the Irish Quarter like wildfire. And, by the end of October, St. Mercy General Hospital had more applications than ever before. Ellen McCarthy, despite her grief, began telling neighbors that perhaps her daughter's sacrifice had somehow contributed to Patrick's healing. Maybe Bridget's pure soul spoke to God on behalf of Mr. O'Malley, she would say through her tears. Maybe her death wasn't meaningless after all. But Mrs. O'Malley couldn't forget what she'd witnessed, and she began paying closer attention to the other patients who received basement treatments. Over the following months, she noticed a disturbing pattern. Patients who entered the sacred treatment chambers fell into two distinct categories: those who emerged completely cured, like her husband, and those who never emerged at all. There seemed to be no middle ground, no partial recoveries or gradual improvements. It was either miraculous healing or death, with nothing in between. The community's faith in St. Mercy remained unshaken because the success stories were so dramatically visible. Cured patients walked through the neighborhood as living testimonies to divine intervention, while the deaths were explained as God's will, calling the purest souls home to heaven. Dr. Whitman's reputation for miraculous healing continued to grow, attracting patients from as far away as New York and Philadelphia. By the winter of 1878, St. Mercy General Hospital had become more than a medical facility. It had evolved into the spiritual heart of Boston's Irish Catholic community. Sunday, services led by Chaplain Sullivan drew congregations of over 400 people, who packed into the hospital's expanded chapel and overflowed into the treatment rooms. His sermons focused on themes of suffering, sacrifice, and divine testing, preparing families psychologically for the possibility that their loved ones might be chosen for heavenly service during treatment. Dr. Whitman's methods became increasingly ritualized during this period. Patients selected for basement treatments underwent elaborate preparation ceremonies that lasted 3 days. Sister Margaret O'Connor would lead them through intensive prayer sessions, fasting, and what she called spiritual purification rituals that involved consuming special teas made from herbs she claimed were blessed by bishops in Rome. Families were told these preparations were necessary to make patients worthy of divine healing, and that any shortcuts or impure thoughts could prevent the miracles from occurring. The hospital's success attracted the attention of wealthy Catholic families throughout New England, who began making substantial donations to support the miracle work being performed in Boston's North End. The Fitzgerald family of Providence donated $5,000 in 1879 after their daughter's consumption was cured following a week of basement treatments. The O'Briens of Hartford contributed $3,000 after their son's broken spine was healed overnight. These donations allowed Dr. Whitman to expand the basement facilities, adding what he called advanced sacred treatment chambers that were equipped with specialized apparatus he claimed were designed according to divine blueprints revealed through prayer and meditation. However, not everyone in the medical community was convinced of St. Mercy's legitimacy. Dr. Samuel Richardson of Boston City Hospital had been quietly documenting the death certificates filed by St. Mercy General Hospital, and he noticed several disturbing anomalies. The causes of death listed on the certificates often didn't match the symptoms described by family members before treatment began. Patients who entered with consumption were listed as dying from heart failure. Children brought in with broken bones were recorded as succumbing to brain fever. Most puzzling of all, the time of death was always listed as occurring between 2 and 4 a.m., regardless of when family members reported their loved ones actually passing away. Dr. Richardson's concerns deepened when he attempted to examine some of the bodies at Flanagan's funeral home, which handled burials for families who couldn't afford more expensive establishments. Michael Flanagan, the funeral director, confided that bodies from St. Mercy General Hospital arrived in sealed coffins with explicit instructions that they were not to be opened under any circumstances. The hospital claims it's for public health reasons, Flanagan explained nervously. But I've been handling diseased bodies for 20 years, and I've never seen restrictions like these. They deliver the coffins in the middle of the night, always with 2 men who watch me sign the paperwork and leave immediately. Something about it just doesn't sit right. When Dr. Richardson attempted to discuss his concerns with city health officials, he was told that St. Mercy General Hospital was under the protection of the Catholic Diocese of Boston and that any investigations would need to be authorized by church authorities rather than civil government. Bishop Williams himself had visited the hospital several times and publicly praised Dr. Whitman's integration of medical science with divine healing. The bishop's endorsement made it virtually impossible for secular authorities to investigate the hospital without appearing to attack the Catholic Church itself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Catherine O'Malley had been conducting her own informal investigation, motivated by memories of young Bridget McCarthy's terrifying final moments. She began visiting families who had lost loved ones at St. Mercy, offering comfort and sympathy while carefully documenting their stories. What she discovered was a pattern of similarity that went far beyond coincidence. Every family described identical final symptoms: violent seizures that lasted exactly 13 minutes, fingernails that turned completely black, and a sweet, rotting smell that lingered in their clothing for weeks after death. Even more disturbing were the testimonies about what happened immediately before death. Multiple witnesses described hearing their family members speaking in unknown languages, reciting what sounded like mathematical equations or chemical formulas in voices that didn't sound entirely human. Sarah Murphy swore her dying husband had spent his final hour reciting a list of numbers in perfect sequence, as if he were reading from an invisible document. He kept saying the same numbers over and over, she told Mrs. O'Malley through tears. 73.4, 41.7, 92.1. Then he would pause exactly 30 seconds and start again. His voice got deeper each time, like someone else was speaking through him. Thomas Kelly reported that his daughter had described in precise detail the interior of buildings she had never visited and people she had never met, as if she were observing events happening in distant locations. Little Mary told me about a room with walls covered in bottles filled with colored liquids and men in white coats writing in leather books, he recounted with visible distress. She described exactly how many windows were in a building across town that she'd never seen, and she knew the names of people who worked there. But the strangest part was how she said it, not like a child playing pretend, but like she was reporting what she could see right in front of her eyes. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of widow Elizabeth Connolly, whose husband Sean had died after receiving treatment for a broken leg sustained in a dock accident. Sean was never an educated man, she explained to Mrs. O'Malley, wringing her hands nervously. He could barely write his own name. But in his final hours he was speaking perfect Latin, not the Latin from church services, but something else entirely. Father McKenna came to give last rites, and even he didn't recognize the words Sean was saying. The priest told me later that some of it sounded like ancient medical terminology that only university-trained physicians would know. Elizabeth's account became even more chilling as she continued. But what really frightened me was how Sean's personality changed completely. He became cold and calculating, asking me questions about our finances, our family connections, and whether anyone would come looking for him if he disappeared. These weren't the confused ramblings of a dying man. They were the methodical inquiries of someone gathering intelligence. When I asked him why he wanted to know such things, he looked at me with eyes that didn't seem like his anymore and said, "Information has value, Elizabeth. Everything has value if you know the right buyers." Mrs. O'Malley also documented the case of young Timothy O'Brien, age 12, who had been brought to St. Mercy with severe pneumonia. His mother, Margaret O'Brien, described symptoms that defied medical explanation. Timothy began speaking in what sounded like German or some other foreign language, Margaret reported, her voice barely above a whisper. But he was also drawing pictures, detailed diagrams of mechanical devices and chemical apparatus that no 12-year-old should be able to imagine, let alone draw with such precision. When I asked him where he learned to draw such things, he said the pictures were already in his head, waiting to be drawn. The most unsettling aspect of Timothy's case was his apparent knowledge of future events. He told me exactly when the church bells would ring each day, predicted when it would rain, and knew which neighbors would visit before they arrived, Margaret continued. But he also predicted his own death down to the exact minute. On his final morning, he told me he would die at 3:47 in the afternoon, and that his body would be taken away in a wooden box that same evening. Everything happened exactly as he said it would. Just when Mrs. O'Malley thought she was uncovering evidence of something sinister, she would encounter one of the miracle patients whose recovery was so complete and dramatic that it challenged her growing suspicions. Her own husband, Patrick, remained perfectly healthy, with lung capacity that surpassed men half his age. Michael Sullivan had recovered from injuries sustained in a construction accident that should have left him permanently paralyzed. Yet he now worked 14-hour days without showing any signs of fatigue. These success stories were impossible to dismiss or explain away, creating a maddening paradox that kept the community's faith intact despite mounting evidence that something was terribly wrong. The winter of 1880 brought an unusually harsh blizzard that trapped Boston under 4 feet of snow for nearly 2 weeks. During this period, when the hospital was completely cut off from the outside world, neighbors reported seeing strange lights emanating from the basement windows at all hours of the night. The lights weren't the steady glow of oil lamps or gas fixtures, but flickering colored illumination that shifted between green, blue, and deep purple. When the storm finally ended and normal operations resumed, 17 patients who had been receiving treatment during the blizzard were reported as having ascended to heavenly glory during the sacred storm. The spring of 1881 brought an unexpected visitor to St. Mercy General Hospital, who would forever change the course of events. Father Giuseppe Benedetti arrived from the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints, sent to investigate the miraculous healings that had been reported to church authorities in Rome. Unlike the local clergy, who had embraced St. Mercy without question, Father Benedetti possessed a methodical, almost scientific approach to evaluating claimed miracles. He had spent 15 years investigating supposed divine interventions throughout Europe and had developed techniques for distinguishing genuine miracles from elaborate frauds. Father Benedetti was a small, quiet man in his early 60s, with sharp grey eyes that missed nothing and a manner of speaking that made people feel compelled to tell him the complete truth. He spoke perfect English with only a slight Italian accent, and his extensive knowledge of medical science often surprised those who expected a typical parish priest. What made him particularly dangerous to any potential deception was his background. In chemistry and anatomy, subjects he had studied at the University of Bologna before entering the priesthood. Dr. Whitman welcomed Father Benedetti with apparent enthusiasm, offering him complete access to patient records and treatment facilities. "We have nothing to hide from God's representative," he declared publicly, though Mrs. O'Malley noticed that the doctor's hands trembled slightly when shaking the priest's hand. "Our work here is blessed by divine grace, and we welcome any opportunity to demonstrate the miraculous power of faith combined with medical knowledge." Father Benedetti began his investigation by examining the documented cases of miraculous healing, requesting detailed medical records from before and after treatment. What he discovered immediately raised concerns. The before records were typically quite detailed, listing specific symptoms, vital signs, and progression of disease. However, the after records were remarkably sparse, usually containing only a single notation. Patient responded completely to sacred treatment. All symptoms resolved. Discharged in perfect health. When Father Benedetti requested to interview some of the miraculously cured patients, he encountered unexpected obstacles. Many of the most celebrated success stories had apparently moved away from Boston shortly after their recovery, leaving no forwarding addresses. Others had died from unrelated causes despite their supposed perfect health. Of the patients he could locate and interview, several exhibited strange memory gaps about their treatment experience. They remembered entering the basement chambers and then waking up completely healthy, but had no recollection of what happened during the actual procedures. Michael Sullivan, the construction worker who had recovered from paralyzing injuries, agreed to meet with Father Benedetti, but struggled to provide coherent details about his healing experience. "It's the strangest thing, Father," he admitted, scratching his head in confusion. "I remember Sister Margaret giving me some tea that tasted like bitter almonds, and then everything becomes fuzzy. I had dreams, at least I think they were dreams, of floating above my body and watching men in white coats doing things to me that I couldn't quite see clearly. When I woke up, I could move my legs again, better than before the accident. But sometimes I have nightmares about being in a place that was both very hot and very cold at the same time, and hearing voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize." Father Benedetti's investigation took a more serious turn when he requested permission to observe one of the sacred treatment sessions firsthand. Dr. Whitman initially agreed, but then imposed increasingly restrictive conditions. The priest would need to undergo the same 3-day purification ritual as the patients. He would be required to take vows of silence about anything he witnessed. Most unusually, he would need to consume the same sanctifying substances given to patients to ensure his spiritual worthiness to witness divine healing. These requirements struck Father Benedetti as highly irregular. In 15 years of investigating miracles, he had never encountered restrictions that prevented church officials from observing claimed divine interventions. Genuine miracles, in his experience, could be witnessed by anyone without special preparation or chemical consumption. The elaborate prerequisites suggested that Dr. Whitman was either dealing with psychological phenomena that required specific mental states or was concealing procedures that wouldn't appear miraculous to trained observers. Father Benedetti decided to conduct a more covert investigation. He enlisted the help of Mrs. Catherine O'Malley, whose unofficial documentation had impressed him with its thoroughness and attention to detail. Together they began mapping the hospital's true layout, timing the movements of staff members, and documenting the arrival and departure of unusual supplies. What they discovered was a complex operation that extended far beyond medical treatment. Late-night deliveries arrived at the hospital's rear entrance 3 times per week, always between 1 and 4 a.m. The deliveries included wooden crates, marked with symbols that Father Benedetti recognized from his studies of medieval alchemy, glass containers filled with liquids that ranged from clear to deep purple, and metal apparatus that looked more like laboratory equipment than medical instruments. Most disturbing were the periodic arrivals of men who didn't appear to be medical professionals, but rather businessmen in expensive suits who met privately with Dr. Whitman in his office, usually carrying leather satchels that they guarded carefully. Mrs. O'Malley discovered that the hospital's basement extended much further than the official blueprints indicated. By carefully pacing the building's exterior and comparing it to the interior layout, she determined that there were at least 3 rooms in the basement that couldn't be accessed through the main staircase. These hidden chambers were connected to a separate entrance that opened onto the alley behind the building, allowing people to enter and exit without being seen by patients or visitors in the main reception area. The breakthrough in Father Benedetti's investigation came from an unexpected source. In late September 1881, a young Irish woman named Molly Flanagan sought him out after Sunday Mass at St. Leonard's Church. Molly worked as a seamstress in a shop near the hospital and had been observing strange activities for months, but hadn't known whom to trust with her concerns. Her testimony would prove to be the key that unlocked the horrifying truth about St. Mercy General Hospital. "Father, I worked late into the evenings, often until past midnight," Molly explained in hushed tones, constantly glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "My shop window faces the back alley behind the hospital, and I've seen things that don't make sense for a place of healing. 3 nights ago, I watched 4 men carry what looked like a body wrapped in canvas from the hospital's rear door to a wagon. But here's what made my blood run cold. The body was moving, not like someone who was alive and struggling, but twitching and jerking like it was being shocked with electricity." Molly's observations became even more disturbing as she continued. "I've seen them burning things in metal barrels behind the building, always in the middle of the night. The smoke that comes from those fires isn't normal. It's thick and green, and it makes a smell that's so awful I have to close my windows even in hot weather. And Father, I swear to you on my mother's grave, I've heard screaming coming from underground. Not the kind of screaming you'd hear from someone in pain, but something else entirely. Something that doesn't sound entirely human." Father Benedetti realized he needed to gather more concrete evidence before making any accusations against such a respected institution. He arranged to spend several nights in Molly's shop, observing the hospital's rear activities through her window. What he witnessed during his surveillance would haunt him for the remainder of his life. On the night of October 3rd, 1881, Father Benedetti watched as Dr. Whitman, Sister Margaret O'Connor, and 2 unknown men in white coats emerged from the hospital's rear entrance carrying what appeared to be a wooden chest about the size of a coffin. The chest was making sounds, not the groaning of settling wood, but rhythmic tapping as if something inside was trying to communicate in code. The men loaded the chest onto a covered wagon and drove away toward the harbor district, returning 3 hours later with the wagon empty. 2 nights later, Father Benedetti observed a scene that convinced him immediate action was necessary. Well-dressed man in an expensive overcoat arrived at the rear entrance carrying a leather satchel and was met by Dr. Whitman. The 2 men spoke briefly before the stranger handed over the satchel and received a small glass vial filled with dark liquid in return. As the stranger held the vial up to the moonlight, Father Benedetti could see him examining it with the practiced eye of someone familiar with chemical substances. The transaction had the unmistakable character of a business deal rather than a medical consultation. Father Benedetti decided to break into the hospital's basement to gather definitive proof of whatever illegal activities were taking place. Using his knowledge of the building's layout and the staff's routine schedules, he gained access through a basement window that faced the alley on the night of October 8, 1881. What he discovered in those underground chambers would exceed his worst expectations and challenge his faith in humanity itself. The basement contained 6 rooms that weren't shown on any official hospital blueprints. The first room housed an elaborate laboratory filled with chemical apparatus, distillation equipment, and hundreds of glass containers filled with substances ranging from clear liquids to thick, colored syrups. Detailed notes in 3 different handwritings documented experiments involving various combinations of chemicals, with careful records of dosages, reactions, and what appeared to be human responses to different formulations. Father Benedetti examined the laboratory notes with growing horror as he realized the sophistication of the operation. The experiments were organized into distinct categories. Neurological response studies involved compounds designed to alter brain function and consciousness. Detailed charts tracked how different dosages of mercury-based solutions affected patients' ability to speak, remember, and recognize family members. Cardiovascular tolerance testing documented the effects of digitalis and other heart-affecting substances, with precise measurements of how much poison a human heart could withstand before failure. Most disturbing were the consciousness transfer experiments, attempts to use chemical compounds to create states where patients would speak with knowledge they had never possessed. The notes described successful trials where subjects under the influence of experimental formulations had demonstrated abilities to read Latin texts, perform mathematical calculations beyond their education level, and describe locations they had never visited. The researchers believed they were chemically accessing some form of universal knowledge, though Father Benedetti suspected the truth was far more sinister. They were systematically destroying patients' minds while documenting the process for European buyers. The laboratory contained apparatus that Father Benedetti recognized from his university studies, but arranged in configurations he had never seen before. Copper coils were connected to glass vessels containing human organs suspended in preservative solutions. Electrical batteries were wired to metal plates designed to deliver controlled shocks to restrained subjects. Most chilling was a series of injection devices calibrated to deliver precise doses of experimental compounds directly into patients' spinal columns and brain tissue. Glass containers lined the walls, each labeled with cryptic codes and containing specimens that made Father Benedetti's stomach turn. Brain tissue samples were preserved in clear liquids, marked with notations about the subject's final words and behavioral changes. Heart specimens showed evidence of chemical damage, with detailed notes about the progression of organ failure under different toxic exposures. Liver samples demonstrated the effects of prolonged poison exposure, documenting exactly how various compounds accumulated in human tissue over time. The second room contained medical equipment that Father Benedetti didn't recognize. Metal tables, with leather restraints positioned at precise angles. Apparatus that looked designed to deliver controlled electrical shocks to specific parts of the human body, and instruments that appeared to be intended for surgical procedures on conscious patients. Most disturbing were the detailed anatomical charts on the walls, marked with notations about optimal injection sites, maximum tolerance thresholds, and preferred extraction points for organ harvesting. Surgical instruments were arranged with military precision, each tool designed for specific procedures that seemed to prioritize data collection over patient survival. Bone saws were marked with measurements for precise cranial openings. Injection needles of various sizes were calibrated for different depths of tissue penetration. Collection vessels were designed to capture and measure blood loss, organ fluids, and other biological specimens during procedures. The most sophisticated equipment appeared to be designed for monitoring patients during experimental procedures. Mechanical devices tracked heart rate, breathing patterns, and body temperature while subjects underwent testing. Recording apparatus documented patients' verbal responses and physical reactions to different compounds. The entire setup was designed to extract maximum scientific data from human suffering while maintaining detailed records for commercial sale. But it was the third room that revealed the true horror of St. Mercy General Hospital. Filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with hundreds of patient records far more detailed than anything maintained upstairs. Each file contained photographs of patients before, during, and after treatment, along with meticulous documentation of their responses to various experimental procedures. The files were organized not by patient name or medical condition, but by categories like high-tolerance subjects, rapid response cases, and most chillingly, expendable test population. Father Benedetti's hands shook as he examined file after file, each revealing a different aspect of the systematic experimentation being conducted on unsuspecting patients. The records showed that Dr. Whitman and his associates were testing pharmaceutical compounds for what appeared to be European chemical companies, using poor Irish immigrants as unwilling test subjects. The miraculous cures were the result of patients who survived experimental treatments that proved effective. The deaths were patients who had received lethal doses or reacted fatally to toxic substances. The files revealed the true identities of the hospital staff. Dr. Charles Whitman was actually Dr. Klaus Weissmann, a German physician who had been expelled from the University of Heidelberg for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Sister Margaret O'Connor was Margaret Osborne, a former nurse who had been dismissed from London Hospital for stealing morphine and falsifying patient records. Chaplain Robert Sullivan was Robert Steinberg, who had never been ordained as a priest, but had learned to conduct convincing religious services during a stint as a confidence man in Philadelphia. Just as Father Benedetti was photographing the most damning evidence with a small camera he had brought for documentation purposes, he heard footsteps on the basement stairs and realized his investigation was about to be discovered. The truth was now within his grasp, but he would need to escape alive to expose the horrifying conspiracy that had claimed 213 innocent lives under the guise of divine healing. Father Benedetti extinguished his small oil lamp and pressed himself against the wall behind the filing cabinets as the footsteps descended the basement stairs. Through a gap between the cabinets, he could see the flickering light of lanterns approaching the hidden laboratory rooms. Two voices became audible, Dr. Whitman speaking in urgent, hushed tones with someone Father Benedetti didn't recognize. "The Vatican investigator is getting too close," Dr. Whitman was saying, his cultured accent slipping to reveal Germanic pronunciation. "Benedetti has been asking questions about patients who can't be produced for interviews. If he discovers the basement operations, 16 years of work will be destroyed, and our European contracts will be terminated immediately." The second voice belonged to a woman, but not Sister Margaret O'Connor. This voice carried a crisp British accent and spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. "Dr. Weissmann, your emotional attachment to this charade is becoming a liability. The syndicate has extracted everything of value from this experiment. We have documented results from 213 test subjects, representing pharmaceutical data worth over $400,000 in European markets. The Irish population experiment has served its purpose." Father Benedetti's blood ran cold as he realized he was overhearing a conversation between the masterminds of the most elaborate medical fraud in American history. The woman continued speaking, revealing details that exceeded even his worst suspicions about the hospital's true purpose. Our buyers in Vienna, Berlin, and London have received complete documentation of tolerance levels, reaction times, and mortality rates for 47 different chemical compounds. The morphine-tolerance studies alone will advance anesthetic research by decades. The hallucinogenic response data has applications in both medical and military fields that our contacts find extremely valuable. Dr. Whitman's response revealed the calculated coldness behind his facade of religious dedication. The beauty of this operation has been its perfect cover. Religious healing attracts the most desperate and least educated patients, people who don't question unusual symptoms or demand detailed explanations. The Irish immigrants have been ideal test subjects, isolated from mainstream medical community, trusting of authority figures, and unlikely to be missed when they don't survive procedures. And the survivors become unwitting testimonials to our legitimacy, the woman added with obvious satisfaction. Patients who respond well to experimental treatments believe they've experienced divine miracles. Their testimonies attract more subjects and discourage official investigation. We've created a self-sustaining system of exploitation disguised as charity. Father Benedetti listened in horror as they discussed the systematic murder of 213 people as if they were laboratory animals. The conversation revealed that the entire operation was funded by a syndicate of European pharmaceutical companies who were willing to pay enormous sums for human testing data that couldn't be obtained legally. The hospital was actually an elaborate front for human experimentation, using religious faith as a weapon against the most vulnerable members of society. "What about Benedetti?" Dr. Whitman asked, his voice betraying growing anxiety. "If he completes his investigation and reports to Rome, the Catholic Church will demand a full investigation by American authorities. Our cover will be blown, and all of us will face murder charges." The woman's response sent chills through Father Benedetti's entire body. Benedetti will not complete his investigation. Tomorrow night, he will volunteer to undergo the same sacred treatment that has claimed so many others. The good father will experience a tragic reaction to our experimental compounds, and his death will be recorded as divine calling during prayer, another martyr to add to St. Mercy's reputation for spiritual transcendence. "How do you propose to force him into treatment?" Dr. Whitman inquired. "Sister Margaret has already begun adding mild psychoactive compounds to the communion wine at St. Leonard's Church," the woman explained with clinical detachment. "Benedetti has been consuming trace amounts of our experimental formulations for 3 weeks, without realizing it. By tomorrow, his judgment will be sufficiently impaired that he can be convinced to undergo voluntary treatment for spiritual purification. Once he's in the basement chambers, he'll receive the same lethal doses that eliminated the other patients who became too curious about our methods." Father Benedetti realized he had perhaps 12 hours to gather evidence, escape from the hospital, and alert authorities before becoming the 214th victim of this monstrous conspiracy. But as he began to move toward the basement window through which he had entered, his foot struck a metal container, producing a sound that echoed through the stone basement chambers. The conversation upstairs stopped immediately. After a moment of terrifying silence, Dr. Whitman's voice called out with deceptive calmness, "Father Benedetti, there's no need to continue hiding. We know you're down there, and we know exactly what you've discovered. Why don't you come upstairs so we can discuss this situation like civilized people?" Father Benedetti's mind raced as he realized his only chance of survival lay in immediate escape. He could hear footsteps moving toward the basement stairs and knew that within moments the laboratory would be surrounded. Clutching the photographs and documents he had gathered as evidence, he moved quickly toward the basement window, praying that his aging body could still move with the agility his desperate situation required. As he reached the window, Father Benedetti heard Dr. Whitman's voice behind him, no longer maintaining its facade of genteel courtesy. "You have interfered with 16 years of groundbreaking medical research, priest. The data we've collected from our subjects will advance pharmaceutical science by generations. You cannot stop progress in the name of misguided morality." Father Benedetti squeezed through the basement window and found himself in the alley behind St. Mercy General Hospital, clutching evidence that would expose one of the most horrific crimes in American medical history. Behind him, he could hear sounds of pursuit, but he also heard something else that made his blood freeze. The distinctive sound of someone loading a rifle. The hunt for the Vatican investigator had begun, and he would need to reach safety before dawn if he hoped to live long enough to reveal the truth about the 213 victims of St. Mercy's unholy experiments. Father Benedetti's desperate flight through the pre-dawn streets of Boston's North End led him directly to the office of Dr. Samuel Richardson at Boston City Hospital, the one physician who had consistently questioned St. Mercy's miraculous claims. Together, they spent the remaining hours before sunrise examining the photographs and documents that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Dr. Richardson's medical expertise allowed him to interpret the experimental data with horrifying clarity. "These aren't random experiments," Dr. Richardson explained as he studied the detailed patient files. "This is systematic pharmaceutical testing on an industrial scale. Look at these dosage progressions. They were deliberately pushing compounds to lethal levels to establish maximum tolerance thresholds. And these chemical formulations, some of these substances weren't even known to exist in American laboratories. They were importing experimental compounds from European research facilities." The documentation revealed that the syndicate had been operating similar facilities in London, Berlin, and Vienna, using different vulnerable populations in each location. The Boston operation specifically targeted Irish immigrants because their isolation from mainstream American society made them ideal subjects for experimentation. When patients died, their deaths could be attributed to pre-existing conditions, divine will, or natural causes without triggering official investigations. Father Benedetti and Dr. Richardson faced a crucial decision about how to expose the conspiracy without allowing the perpetrators to escape justice. A direct approach to city authorities might give Dr. Whitman and his associates time to destroy evidence and flee the country. Instead, they decided to coordinate simultaneous raids on both the hospital and several addresses mentioned in the documents as storage facilities for experimental compounds. At exactly 6 a.m. on October 9, 1881, Father Benedetti presented his evidence to Bishop Williams while Dr. Richardson alerted city police and federal authorities. The timing was critical because the morning shift change at St. Mercy would provide maximum opportunity to apprehend all conspirators before they could coordinate their escape plans. The raid on St. Mercy General Hospital uncovered evidence that exceeded even Father Benedetti's worst expectations. In addition to the basement laboratory, investigators discovered a hidden sub-basement containing preservation tanks filled with human organs, detailed anatomical studies, and correspondence with buyers throughout Europe who were purchasing biological specimens for research purposes. The conspiracy wasn't limited to pharmaceutical testing. They had been harvesting organs from deceased patients and selling them to medical schools and research facilities that didn't ask questions about the source. Dr. Klaus Weissman, the man known as Dr. Charles Whitman, was arrested while attempting to destroy documents in his office. Margaret Osborne, posing as Sister Margaret O'Connor, was captured at the harbor while boarding a ship bound for Liverpool with trunks filled with patient files and chemical samples. Robert Steinberg, the false chaplain, managed to escape initially, but was apprehended 3 days later in New York when he attempted to book passage to Hamburg under his real name. The arrests revealed connections to an international network of illegal human experimentation that stretched across 3 continents. European authorities used the evidence gathered in Boston to raid similar facilities in London, Berlin, and Vienna, ultimately exposing what newspapers called the most extensive medical conspiracy in modern history. The syndicate had been operating for nearly 2 decades, using religious institutions, orphanages, and charity hospitals as cover for systematic human experimentation. The fate of the 213 documented victims became a source of ongoing investigation and controversy. Exhumation of bodies from the hospital's private cemetery revealed that many coffins contained animal remains or were completely empty, suggesting that actual human remains had been shipped to European research facilities for continued study. Families who had believed their loved ones died natural deaths during medical treatment discovered they had actually been murdered for profit in elaborate pharmaceutical experiments. The few patients who had genuinely recovered from their illnesses presented a complex moral dilemma for investigators. These individuals had indeed been cured of serious medical conditions, but their healing had come at the cost of hundreds of other lives lost in experimental procedures. The treatments that saved them had been developed through systematic murder, creating a terrible paradox that challenged conventional notions of medical ethics and divine intervention. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley's husband, Patrick, whose miraculous recovery from tuberculosis had been one of St. Mercy's most celebrated successes, struggled with the knowledge that his healing might have contributed to the deaths of other patients. "How can I be grateful for my life when it came from such evil?" he asked Father Benedetti during one of their conversations after the conspiracy was exposed. "Was my recovery a blessing from God, or was I just lucky enough to survive something that killed 213 other innocent people?" The international scandal surrounding St. Mercy General Hospital led to significant reforms in medical oversight and religious institutional monitoring. The Catholic Church implemented new requirements for verifying the credentials and backgrounds of medical personnel operating under church auspices. American authorities established federal oversight of experimental medical procedures and required detailed documentation of all pharmaceutical testing involving human subjects. The building that housed St. Mercy General Hospital was demolished in the spring of 1882, but the site remained vacant for over 3 decades because local residents believed it was cursed. Eventually, the lot was purchased by the city and converted into a small park with a memorial plaque honoring the 213 victims of what became known as the St. Mercy Murders. The plaque's inscription reads simply, "In memory of those who sought healing and found death. May their sacrifice teach us to question those who claim divine authority over human suffering." Dr. Klaus Weissmann was sentenced to death and executed in 1883, maintaining until his final moments that his experiments had advanced medical science and saved more lives than they had cost. Margaret Osborne received a life sentence and died in prison in 1901, reportedly spending her final years claiming that she had been genuinely devoted to helping patients and had been deceived about the true nature of the experimental procedures. Robert Steinberg was sentenced to 25 years but served only 12 before dying of consumption in 1893. The same disease he had falsely claimed to cure through divine intervention. Father Giuseppe Benedetti returned to Rome in 1882, where he spent the remainder of his career developing protocols for investigating claimed miracles that would prevent similar frauds from using religious faith as a cover for criminal activity. His detailed reports on the St. Mercy case became required reading for Vatican investigators and established standards for verifying divine healing that remain in use today. The most disturbing legacy of the St. Mercy conspiracy was the discovery that similar operations had been attempted in other American cities, targeting different vulnerable populations with various forms of fraudulent religious healing. The success of the Boston facility had inspired imitators who sought to exploit religious faith for profit, leading to a wave of investigations that revealed the extent to which unscrupulous individuals were willing to manipulate desperate people's belief in divine intervention. In the decades following the exposure of the St. Mercy murders, historians and medical researchers continued to study the case as an example of how institutional authority and religious faith could be weaponized against society's most vulnerable members. The detailed records maintained by the conspirators provided unprecedented insight into both the methods used to exploit religious communities and the psychological techniques employed to maintain victims' cooperation even when they were being systematically murdered. The story of St. Mercy General Hospital serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the mask of charity, and that those who claim to speak for God must be held to the highest standards of accountability and transparency. The 213 victims of this conspiracy died believing they were receiving divine healing, when in reality they were being sacrificed on the altar of scientific ambition and corporate greed. Their deaths challenge us to remain vigilant against those who would exploit our faith, our desperation, and our trust in the pursuit of power and profit. If you've stayed with this dark tale until the end, you're clearly not like most people. You have the courage to confront the uncomfortable truths that others prefer to ignore. The story of St. Mercy General Hospital reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear white coats and religious habits, and they speak of healing while they destroy. What do you think about this horrifying chapter in American medical history? Do you believe that such systematic evil could be hidden behind religious authority for 16 years without anyone else knowing the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has given you chills, share it with someone else who appreciates dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our research into these buried secrets, and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to explore the shadows of history. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often those who convince us they're our saviors.